Thank you very much for dedicating your time and your attention to us. We're very glad to have you all here to talk about the Brontë sisters, three authors that we appreciate a lot here in A Book a Month. And today we have prepared something slightly different for you guys. Okay, so can you move on, Anna, please? Before we get there, just a brief presentation for those of you that are meeting us for the first time. So great to see you here. We're glad to have you. Nice to meet you. I'm Audio. I'm one of the teachers here at A Book a Month. I'm a PhD in literature, and currently I pursue my research in literature at the University of Padua as a postdoctoral researcher in Italy. And Anna is the professor that will be talking to us today. She is also a PhD in literature. She has also pursued a postdoctoral research in São Paulo and in Germany. And she's actually not only a teacher at A Book a Month, but the founder of A Book a Month itself. Okay, please go on, Anna. And just to clarify, A Book a Month is actually a method to practice a foreign language while reading, right? So while studying literature. The idea is that you're doing the two things at the same time. Please go on, Anna, with the slide. So it's not that you're only learning literature, and it's not that you're only practicing English. You're combining the two things. So you're using the foreign language as a tool to achieve another goal, okay? So, or if you want to twist everything on its head, you can think you're learning literature and at the same time you're improving your English. So it depends which one of the two you prefer, you want to stress, but we're always doing both at the same time. A Book a Month has been around already for 4 years. So we're very glad to commemorate that. And today's class is actually something that we prepared from scratch for you guys. Usually when we do these open classes, sometimes we're teaching things that we have already thought and discussed with our students. But today we wanted to prepare something new for you as part of this new course that we're releasing called Big Reads, a course that is that it aims to read quite big volumes, right? So lengthy volumes, and we'll start with the Brontë sisters themselves. So Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and Agnes Grey. So these three masterpieces of English literature. So this class will be discussing these authors, okay, their lives. We'll talk a little bit more than usual about their biography, and we have selected some key elements in their lives that are very revealing about the way they produce literature, but also about literature in general during the 19th century. So we hope you enjoyed it, and if that's all, Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, guys.
All righty, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. And as I said earlier, I apologize because I'm feeling a little bit sick. Might even have a temperature, but I'm here for the love of the Brontes and for literature and for you. So thank you very much for being here. We are also streaming on YouTube, and my mom asked me to do this for her, which is the Korean symbol of I love you, because she's watching me from Brazil, and she wanted me to say hello before we started. So there you go. Hey, Mom. So people, today we're going to talk about this trio, this magic trio, as sometimes I like to refer to them, of literature since they are some of the most important writers of 19th century literature in English or in the English language, right? So they're pretty important. Therefore, they really deserve this kind of attention that we are giving them in a book a month this semester and in the history of literature itself. So I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of them before, but this is the only ascertained painting that we have representing her. We have pictures saying that they are her, or maybe other paintings representing, saying that they are them, but it's usually we don't have much sure because they were very private. And the only one that we know for sure that is them is this, right? Here from the left, we have Anne Brontë, who was the youngest. Here we have Emily, and here is the eldest, Charlotte, right? All of them, they lived in the first half of the 19th century, and their work really shows it, right? But of course, in order to be able to talk about the Brontë sisters, right, as we usually refer to them, we have to talk about the Brontë family as well, because this is how it all started, right? So their father was called Patrick Brontë, and he was from Belfast. He was from Northern Ireland, and he moved into England in order to be a clergyman, right? Something that many, not necessarily poor people, but some people that did lack a little bit of means did in their time, right? So he moved into England. He got a scholarship to be able to study to be a clergyman in Cambridge, right? And then from there on, he started to do his career as a clergyman in the north of England, right? And he got married very early to Maria Branwell. She was from Cornwall. They had 6 children, right, which is the whole totality of the Brontë sister, the Brontë family itself. But she died, like sadly, she died very young. I think that probably Anne, which was who was the youngest, she was 4 or 5 years old when she passed away, and she died of cancer. And her sister, she decided to move in with the family in order to help them, to help Patrick itself to raise the children, right? And he never remarried, and he decided to become like a bachelor throughout his whole life. And he outlived the whole family, right? Because the sisters, they died quite young, and he died when he was already 84 something, right? 84 years old. So their life biography is a bit tragic, right? But they left a legacy behind them. Yeah. And when we see this picture, we tend to refer to them, and we tend to think about the picture itself as representing the Brontë sisters, right? But I told you that the family constituted 6 children, right? 2 of them died earlier. They were older than Charlotte, and they died in their early teens, right, of tuberculosis. But we also have somebody else who is in this picture. Yes, when you see here the shadow of somebody, it's not a shadow that was there on purpose. It's a shadow that is a result of the paint wearing off throughout the years. And this is Patrick Branwell, the brother, right? And he was younger than Charlotte, and he was one of the eldest, right? As you see. And we have this wearing off, showing this shadow, which is a result of untreated painting, right? But he is there somehow. And therefore, when we think about the Brontë sisters, and their history together and how they started in literature and how they started writing. We also have to think about Branwell, right? He was part of their history to become writers, and he contributed a lot to this point as well. We don't know much about him and them, as a matter of fact, because they were very private. But we do know that he, before them having like the legacy of the family, he, as the male heir in the 19th century, he was appointed as the person, as the future of the family, the future to support the whole family, right? To succeed the father, who was also called Patrick, right? And he was actually a very talented man. He painted, he was trained in architecture, he wrote, he translated. So he did have a very interesting contact with literature and with the different kinds of arts, and he was very good at it, right? And he was starting to be trained to be an artist of the Royal Society of Arts, right? Which is like the most prestigious place as you can have in the matter of arts in the UK. Yes. And he was the person who painted this painting. Yes. What we really don't know is why he has erased himself from the painting. If you see it, before we had the shadow itself, he painted a pillar in the middle, right? And he self-erase himself from their history somehow, right? We don't know what happened there. And he also painted this portrait of what the critics usually tend to say it is Emily, but there is a dispute whether it's Emily or Anne. Yes, but usually people refer to it as a portrait of Emily. He died also quite young, and he had a tragic death. We can talk about it a little bit later. The family lived in the far north. Yes, please.
Just a quick comment, guys. It is interesting that they were not very wealthy. You know, the Brontes were not exactly poor, but they kind of struggled with daily living. And this is one of the reasons that for which we don't have really photos of them. We only have, photography was a new technology in the 1850s when most of them died. And so we don't have any photos. There is one photo that circulates in the internet that the people often identify with the three sisters, but it's very, very likely to be apocryphal. Okay, some literary critics and photography historians think it might be real, but there's a very small chance, and most likely it's just someone else that we think are them. So his paintings are actually Branwell's paintings are actually the only window, the only glimpse that we have into how they looked like actually, more or less. This is pretty much the only two things we have: this painting by Emily or Anne, and then the other one in which initially you had the four siblings, and then he erased himself out on purpose. Okay, so we know that he did it, and we know that it was done on purpose. So some kind of fallout, or for some reason, I don't know, he didn't want to be in the family picture anymore.
That's true. Yeah. And we also have like some other family portraits that were painted or done or drawn by Charlotte herself, right? She has done one of Emily and one of Anne as well. This is what we have of them. Yes. So it's really a state of socioeconomics, but also like the way that the family was organized. So they lived in the far north of the UK, right? Almost when we're hitting Scotland, and in a very, very small city, right? This is when they were already around 5 years old, or their early preteens, depending on their age, on who they were. And I brought this here just to show you something that to me makes a lot of sense in order to understand who they were as writers, right? Which is, take a look at this small town and take a look what surrounds it. Of course, nowadays we have the grouse inn or the old silent inn, but at the time it didn't have anything, right? It was just nature, yes. And nature and this very isolated place in the north of England, that was their household, yes. Holworth, you can see here, you have like part urbanization. The most part of it is really feuds, right? And this is really important for their work when they become mature writers. And this is the house that they lived most of their lives. Nowadays, it's called the Brontë Parsonage Museum, right? And they became a literary archive about the Brontes, but also you can visit it if you go to the UK, and if you go to Haworth, you can really visit the place that they lived most of their lives. But of course, we also, in order to understand their work, you have to really talk about the landscape that surrounded them, right? Because this is important to understand what they're talking about. The city that they lived, it was surrounded by the moors, which is something that all of them, they talk a lot about in their books. And the region of Yorkshire. Yes, and the moors is really a higher place in terms of terrain, but also is like this kind of vegetation which is plain, right? Which is flat. You have some bushes, and it also coincides a little bit with what we call, for instance, the British heath, right? Heath is a name that probably, if you read Wuthering Heights, you will remember it, right? So we have some upper lands which tend to be mountainous, as we have in this picture here, but we also have some parts which have this lower vegetation, and it tends to be a little bit wet and uncultivated, right? You cannot grow food in here. So this is something that is very important. Somehow, I think that in their books, they tend to transform this place in a somber and inhospitable place sometimes, right? Which might be the case of isolation that they lived, right? Which was really, really isolated. In order for them to travel to London, for instance, they would have to travel 17 hours, something like that, right? Which nowadays you can do like in a 2 hour of train ride. So it was more difficult, and it shows a lot. Yes. And something that I believe it's quite interesting to talk about, the rise of the Brontes as the writers that we know nowadays. It has really started in their early infancy, when they were around 9 or 10 years old. In a time that there was no YouTube, no Instagram, no social media, nothing. What they had was really their imagination to play with. So playing together, they did a lot of what we call world building. Something that we do nowadays in modern terms in role-playing games, RPGs, right? You know, those kids that gather around and they play a game together and they create those imaginary characters, imaginary worlds. This is more or less what they were doing, but in writing. Luckily for us, they lived in a time that it wasn't digital. So we do have the manuscripts, right? So we can know a little bit of what they were creating and doing during this time. And something that is fantastic and singular about their experience is that they started writing in these very, very tiny pieces of books which could fit in the palm of your hand, and they were really meant for complementing a set of wood soldiers that Bremel, the boy, had gotten as a birthday gift from his father. And of course, if you are the only boy living amongst three or four other girls, you know that you're going to have to share, right? And all of them, they used to share their toys and they used to play together. And one of the reasons why we have such smaller dimensions of these little books is because they were meant for the little soldiers to read. This is at least what the specialists talk about. But the other reason would be because they would write all sorts of things in this little magazines that they were producing together. They would have like poems, they would have short stories, they would have like personal gossip around the aristocratic people that they knew, and they would comment about their lives, and probably they would sound a little bit improper for their age, and they would be reprimanded by the father, who was a clergyman. He was a reverend, right? So he was deeply religious. So they had to hide a little bit of what they did, right? So this is one of the reasons why these books are so tiny, as you can see here. And they used to write in very, very small letters, really to have their imaginary privacy if they could. Yes. And what is really surprising about the way that they have conceived this world, the fictional worlds that they were creating together, is that they used to name them. They used to create societies to live in them. They used to create languages that they were speaking, right? So something that we see a lot in modern fantasy books, for instance, right? And they together, as children, Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne, they have created what they called the glass towns, right? Or the glass world. And they used to conceive it in a very complex way, right? They used to create who they were, who the people were, what is their history. They used to associate all different kinds of details concerning the glass town and their imaginary universe that they were creating together. Here are some of the illustrations that they did, right? And they used to do it to talk about different kinds of ideas, like battles, like glory, like gossip, everything that they could, they would insert in these little writings. But of course, if you're creating an imaginary world, you gotta, if you want to make it a little bit more concrete, you gotta create what the world that they were living in, right? And this is exactly what they did, right? If you take a look, this is a map of Glasstown that was composed by all of them when they were children, right? And it's quite intricate, right? It's quite complex. You can see the rivers, you can see the mountains, you can see the names of the countries, the islands. It's really an archipelago, in also an attempt of constructing a continent, right? And of course, this was based on the world that they knew, and they didn't know much because they lived in a very isolated place and they didn't travel anywhere, but they traveled a lot with their imagination. Yes. And of course, yes, Auto, please.
One thing for us to have in mind is that Glasstown is related to the real world, so it's fantastic because there is no such a place. But it's also imbued in our real geography. If I'm not mistaken, it's in the coast of Africa, for example, and you have four islands, and each island belonged to one of the siblings. Okay, so each island had a capital, and all the capitals are called glass towns. So they always have the same names. And each one of the three sisters, and plus the brother, the Patrick, they were responsible for producing these tiny, tiny books, and there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And those books were like newspapers, you know. So you would have poems, you would have reviews from other books. So, you know, they were producing the newspapers that would be circulating in their country. Okay, so this is pretty crazy because these guys were like 11, so they are very precocious in this sense. They were trying out, they wrote several, like really 6 or 7 different theater plays for the soldiers. Okay, so really they were trying their hands with poetry, with theater, with short stories, with gossip, as Anna was mentioning. So many different genres and many different types of literary production, okay, in a very complex, really world building. World building is an expression that we use to talk about video games, to talk about RPG, right? RPG in Portuguese. But also it applies to literature. It is actually originally coming from literary theory, right? So this is really fascinating to think how young they are actually, right?
Yes, yes, and how inventive, right? But of course, right, and I think also it shows something that is very important for this family, which is the father, who was the surviving parent. He believed in education for all, not only for the boy, right? And all of them, they had some kind of training, and he would take pride in it as well, right? So the girls, they had literary training, the boy had literary training. So this is going to be an important step for their future career, that we're going to talk a little bit ahead in our presentation today. But it's something that I think that this kind of technique of world building, it's in the concreteness of it. And when we look at it, we see the map. It kind of reminds us of something else, right? I don't know if it reminds you of the same thing, but to us, it really reminds us of this guy here, right, Audi?
Yep. So when we talk about world building, people immediately think about Tolkien, right? Because we have all watched The Lord of the Rings. If we haven't read it, if we haven't watched it, go watch it. But you've heard from it, I'm 100% sure. If you live at least in the 21st century, you have. And so Tolkien's name is synonymous with world building. The guy invented several languages. He created an alphabet, he created the maps and the mythology, and he drew, if you can move on one slide, Anna, please. This is a drawing by Tolkien, for example. This is his Smaug in The Hobbit. This is a drawing that he drew. He could draw quite well, actually. And another slide, please. Even the cover of The Hobbit, it is actually designed by him. And you can see this is his own drawing. And you can see like on the margins, Tolkien is writing for himself, making notes and comments and stuff. So this is something that we usually associate, world building to fantasy, okay? Fantasy as opposed to reality, right? So magic and things like that. So think Harry Potter, think Neil Gaiman. You can think of many different things, but we also associate world building with science fiction, and you can create a new world in any way you want. So this is not only something we find in fantasy, but we do find especially there. And I find it very interesting that when we talk about the Brontë sisters, if you tell someone, oh, I'm reading Jane Eyre, I'm reading Wuthering Heights, they will not start talking about science fiction to you because we don't see a connection there, right? But strangely enough, world building was a stepping stone, a really important part of the productions of the Brontë sisters. This is where they developed their skills. This is where they really, for years and years, they wrote these short, tiny books until their adulthood, actually. Not only they died very young, but they continued. They never stopped. They stopped being children, but they continued with that production. So, when we think about Emily Bronte, for example, She only wrote one book, only Wuthering Heights, nothing else. Not a short story, not any other novel, nothing, just Wuthering Heights. And it's an absolute masterpiece. So how, how do you produce something that is unique without, trying before? And one of the ways she did is precisely because she trained for years uh, through world building in a similar way to Tolkien, right? So go ahead, Anna, please. So we can see this in the map of Middle Earth, right? You can see Mordor over there. And so as you can imagine, the world of the Hobbit is connected with the world of the Lord of the Rings and that of the Silmarillion and so on. And the Brontë sisters and brother were doing exactly the same thing. They created not only one world, but actually three different worlds. We won't have time to talk about all of them. So we're just mentioning the first one, but there are other two. If one was not enough for you, they have three. And go on, please, Anna. But so although we think about Tolkien, they were the forefront of this. They did it 100 years before, actually. And we'll be talking, if you like this kind of experiment of narrative, we'll be talking about fantasy in our novels intermediate course, which, by the way, will be taught by Anna. We'll start with Coraline by Neil Gaiman, that is flirting with Gothic fiction and children's literature. Then we'll move into C.S. Lewis, right? The Chronicles of Narnia, the very first volume, and then The Hobbit itself. And then we'll explore different turns on fantasy. One, reimagining the Odyssey by Margaret Atwood. This book is called The Pelopyliad, and it's actually a retelling of the story of the Odyssey, but in a woman's perspective, right? So it's a very interesting novel. And finally, we'll end up with Carmilla, this one of the early masterpieces of Gothic fiction and one of the first vampire stories, So there's an interesting transformation in the concept of what fantasy actually is, Go on. But actually, if we want to think about this concept of world building, this is something that does not belong to only one genre. It is not peculiar to fantasy or to sci-fi. It is something that you can find pretty much everywhere, in realist fiction, in movies, or in poetry. Okay, so one great example is William Blake, if you go on, who has created an entire mythology to use in his poems, and he would call them prophetic poems, right? So there is, please go on. He created what is called the Albion mythology, which is an alternative mythology for England, which is quite complicated. He creates many gods and goddesses and demigods and stuff. He was also very much like the Brontë sisters and brother, let's call them the Brontë siblings. Very much like them, he would be producing his own manuscripts. He was an illustrator, so he would write the poems, he would make the images, he had his own printing press. And so he would create these beautiful manuscripts with many, many illustrations and the poems at the side. And these pages are quite tiny. They are bigger than the books we have seen so far, but they're like maybe this big, like a pocketbook. They're very tiny. So even the script that Blake adopts is hard to read. It's very, you need a glass to look at it properly. At least I do. So even that might be related. For sure, even at this young age, they would be reading a lot of poetry. They would certainly know William Blake, because William Blake is one of the greatest poets ever, in my opinion. Certainly one of the biggest names in English poetry, definitely. Side by holding hands with Shakespeare, no doubt. So Blake is one of the authors. Yes, Anna?
Now, I was just going to mention something else that they have in common, right? Blake was also very poor. Actually, when he passed away, he was buried as like a pauper, right? It's even hard to find like his remains in the cemetery that he lies in, and he never left his neighborhood in London, right? So the isolation itself promotes like imaginary creations and all of these fruitful results that we have from the publications of both William Blake and the Brontes, right?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so Blake is one of the authors we'll be reading in the reading class course, okay? The reading class is taught by me this time, and it is happening every week. The idea in this course is a bit different. Rather than reading the book by yourself and then coming to class to be taught and also to discuss with your colleagues, in this course, in the reading class, you don't have to read anything before. You just have to come to class for an hour and a half, and then we do all the reading together. And then this is pretty cool because we have the opportunity to comment word by word, sentence by sentence, paraphrase, think about it. And so this allows us to discuss not only very short stories, but also poetry, right? Which is known for being difficult, and a lot of people don't have the habit of reading poetry. So in this course, we'll be reading three poets. We'll start with Shel Silverstein, who writes poems for children in the USA. Then we'll move on to William Blake, this great poet from the 18th and the late 18th and early 19th century, often called the proto-romantic, really brilliant guy. And by the second half of the semester, you can see him in here, okay? The jewel in the crown, William Shakespeare himself will be reading Shakespeare for an entire month. The sonnets, parts of Romeo and Juliet and parts of Hamlet, and besides a whole constellation of amazing writers. You can see Nabokov in there, you can see Dickens, Hemingway, Margaret Atwood, one of my personal favorites, Kate Chopin, really great realist writer from the US, Angela Carter, who has died a few decades ago, really great contemporary writer. So it is really a great course. That's all I have to say. Go on.
Good. All right. Cool. And also, I think that we know the Brontë sisters, coming back to them, right? We know them as a huge success now. Yes. But in their earliest publications, they also had to face a literary failure. And we're going to talk a little bit about their path, their journey there. Everything really started with Charlotte going through her sister's stuff when she shouldn't have, right? And she went through Emily's things in search for something that she was writing. Probably she had seen Emily writing in her private time, right? But Emily was a very, very shy and private person. Like of all of them, she was the shyest and the more introverted of the siblings, right? And she found a book of poetry written by Emily, and she was astounded by the quality, right? And I don't know if you ever read poems by Emily Dickinson, by Emily Dickinson or Emily Brontë, but we do have. She is a great poet, right? She is amazing. And when Charlotte read those poems, she went in like in awe. She had to do something within. And of course, the fact that they were very poor and that their father they thought at the time was getting older, and Branwell, the brother, was getting sicker, they would be without anybody, because in England at the time, they couldn't inherit anything. So they would have to be on their own, right? That means poverty for them. So they had to find some ways in order to provide for themselves. And what they could do as well-educated women was also writing and trying to be published. So after going through Emily's stuff and then finding this collection of poems written in a very private manner, and thinking that they were amazing, she tried to convince Emily in order to publish, and Emily was furious. She was head over heels furious, right? She was completely maddened by what Charlotte had done, to the point that Anne had to intervene, right? Because it was getting to a family feud. And Anne intervened, and she also shared that she herself was writing some poems. And then Charlotte said, oh, but well, I do have some poems as well. So maybe if we unite forces, we can try and publish something. But of course, nobody could know, right? Because they were doing something for themselves. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were daughters of a very religious reverend. So they would have to find their ways before really attempting to do it. So this is really when their stardom in anonymity started, right? They all chose some pen names, some pseudonyms in order to be writing. And if you see all of the pen names, they have their initials, right? C. Currer Bell for Charlotte Brontë, right? CB. Acton Bell for Anne Brontë. Ellis Bell for Emily Brontë, right? And if you take a look at the first names, these are names that we tend to think, okay, well, I cannot really tell if this is like a man or a woman. They are sort of non-gender associated, right? So this was what they wanted to do. And the initiative to create this last name, it is associated also with the last name of their mother, right? Patrick Branwell Brontë had the last names of both mother and father. Brontë for father, Branwell from mother, right? So they shortened Branwell, or maintained the B and got the ending of Branwell and got Bell, yes. And something that caught my attention in this attempt is really associated with the fact that even in an imaginative pen name, right, they were related, right, because they all have the same last name. And Currer, who was actually Charlotte, she was the one corresponding with the editors and doing all the negotiations in the name of her relatives, as she would say, right? So they were sisters in reality, but also sisters or brothers in fiction, right? So they were a family that was, in reality, they were writers, but also in fiction, they were family. So it's something quite remarkable about the way that they have created this reputation for themselves, yes. And so they did in a way that many other writers had done before, right? They either, many women writes, they either had the option to hide their identity or use a pseudonym, right? So, for instance, in her first publication, Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility, she signed as only as by a lady. And then in the publication of Pride and Prejudice, which was done 2 years later, we have by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Yes. But we don't have like a publication with Jane Austen's names in this too, right? We're gonna have like years later. I think only after she died, there was a revelation of her identity. Yes. But of course, here she puts a lady because the content of her novel was mild, right? It was not full of scandal or something, right? Which was something that if you've read some of the Bronte's works, you'll see that for the time they were writing about things that maybe women shouldn't be writing in the perception of society, right? Of their society. The same thing goes for Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein was a success when it was published, and it was published without any kind of indication of an author. But Mary Shelley, she got the preface of her husband, Percy Shelley, who was already very famous, right? A very important writer of Romanticism. And it led to some point of the critics, for the critics to think that he was the one who was authoring Frankenstein, right? Which was also considered to be not a work for a woman to be writing. Yes. So in this sense, I think that the idea of hiding your identity is either to protect yourselves or to maybe try and get more sales. Yes. Which unfortunately was not the fact for the poems by Curry Ellis and Acton Bell, right? All of them, they contributed with, I think, 2 and 2, 21, right? And then another one, I don't know which, was only with 19 poems. And this one was a failure. They sold the bagatelle of 2 copies, right? And they actually had to pay to publish it, right? They paid £50. £50 is like 1/4 of their father's earning of the whole year, right? So they spent a lot of money. They put a lot of effort, and they sold 2 copies, right? And it was very interesting that this week on the 30th of July was the celebration of Emily's birthday, right? And I think Editora Antofágica was publishing about this literary greatest hits and also the downfalls. And they published this about the poems because it was a shame, right? They only sold 2 copies. But with that, they kind of understood that success was not really in poems for them, but it was perhaps in novels, as it was the big success at the time, right? It was the most profitable kind of genre. So they started their path into being a sensation. Yes, Audio, please.
I made some quick calculations in here. So they had to pay £50 to publish this book, right? Expecting for some revenue. If we correct this was done in 1846. So if we correct the inflation for today, and I'm always doing this, I think this is really fascinating. Today it is about £7,300, which means about 53,000 reais. Okay, so they wanted to earn some money. They invested 53,000 and they sold 2 copies. Basically, you have 3 writers. So even one of the sisters did not buy her own book. I mean, not even the family was buying, right? Only 2 copies. So quite tragic, actually. It was an absolute failure from this point perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, like, it's not well, Charlotte would say that her poems, she thought that they weren't good. Anne's they were mild, but Emily's were sensational, right? Her poems were sensational. So maybe, I don't know,
And she's
we
right.
cannot.
Right? I think we can trust Charlotte's opinion as a literary critic because it is true. When we read nowadays, Emily's poems are amazing, and it's true. Charlotte's are nice, Emily and kind of okay, but
More or less.
Emily strike us, right?
Yes, that's true. That's true. I will record the next Poetry Saturday reading something by Emily Brontë for you to release this week. But everything changed when they changed the kind of genre that they were publishing in, right? And we know that because we are living in the 21st century and we are talking about them today, discussing this beautiful text, right? So they submitted, in the same year, they submitted the manuscripts for Agnes Grey. by Acton Bell, Wuthering Heights by Alice Bell, and The Professor by Currer Bell, by Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. And the first two, they got a good acceptance from the editors, but The Professor didn't. They didn't want to publish The Professor, so it would only be published many years later, right? And this is something that maybe in the beginning saddened Charlotte a little bit, but also triggered her to write something else that we know nowadays to be Jane Eyre, right? Which is the great novel about this great coming of age story that we all know and love. And I think that all of them, they do have lots to contribute, right? But I think that Jane Eyre, she got like instant success. She got to see it being reenacted in theater when she was still alive, right? Charlotte, right? So Wuthering Heights was when it was published, it also all of them, they were a success together. They were published in 1847. So it is like if you were living in 1847, it was a great year to be alive because all these three masterpieces, they were published together. But all of them, they also came a little bit with controversy, right? As we know for sure. We are reading these novels in the Novels Big Reads, right? Wuthering Heights is one of the most of the three that is very famous. It's about tormented love, lots of somber characters, unresolved, impossible love, and a great song by Kate Bush, if you know it, right? If you know, you know it, which has instilled it. It's a very passionate book, and we can see the poetics of Emily in Wuthering Heights. Yes, the poetics of the landscape, the poetics of love itself, and the sobriety of something that we really love, which are the hints of Gothic that we see in the story. We also will read Jane Eyre and Agnes Grey. Both of them, they talk about something that the sisters were. They were both governess, right? Which was the natural path for a woman who was well educated, but had to work. Yes. But both of them, they hated doing governess jobs, right? I think Anne even talks about how it was something that she associated with being in captivity, being in prison. So she hated it, right? Charlotte as well, she really wanted to write. She wasn't a writer. She really wanted to have time to write. And Jane Eyre talks about this orphan girl that is brought up in an orphanage, and she becomes a governess in a very wealthy family. And the connection that, well, you know the story, right? It's a classic. I'm not going to spoil anything. I think that you have already heard about the plot. But it's going to talk about bigamy. It's going to talk about infidelity, right? It's going to talk about colonialism in a critical way. And the same thing goes for Agnes Grey, right? She's going to be very critical in the book. She's going to talk about sexuality, the same thing that happens in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, women's being sexual, having desire, right? A Black character, right? All of this was somehow associated with something improper for single ladies, unmarried ones, right? Be writing about. So also this was one of the reasons that they hid their identities. And we're going to read these books in the first and the second in 2 months because they're huge, right? They're longer. And this is the proposal of the Novels Big Reads. We take longer to read in order for them not to be overbearing, yes. And the last one, which is shorter than we read throughout only 1 month, yes. But I mean, this whole complexity of the story of the Brontes is really hard for us as literary critics to think about what kind of genre are we talking about? What kind of literary movement are they associated with, right? Are they Gothic? Are they romantic? Are they realist, right? What is that they have, and how can we categorize them? And this is a struggle that many historians of literature also face when talking about books as such, right? We can say for sure that Wuthering Heights does serve a little bit more of what Gothic fiction offers to the public, right? It's not a ghost story, but it has ghosts, right? So it's not the essential thing of it, right? But it does flirt with the idea of the somber aesthetics of the like the this claustrophobic architecture, these places which tend to be both like open wide in landscape, but also isolating and overbearing in the same way. Jane Eyre doesn't have apparitions, but she mentions that Jane Eyre herself, she was afraid of spirits and ghosts, right? So there is a direct mention of that. And there is a sort of apparition, but then it's explained, right? So it's not necessarily a ghost story. And when we're talking about Anne Bronte's novel, it's much more on the other side, right? And which side is this? It is like much more flirting with realism, because they were publishing the stories all three in the same year in 1847, and they were writing some months or a year earlier. And the rise of the Gothic in English literature was actually done in the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. But still, it's not that they are outdated, right? Because there were still going to be other very important works, the core of Gothic, to be published, right? For example, Carmilla by the Irish novelist Sheridan Le Fanu, which is about the female vampire, is going to be published in 1872. Dracula by Bram Stoker is going to be published in 1897. And then we also have the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which was going to be published by the end of the 19th century as well. So they are not late. They are right in the middle, and they are interacting with the fashion of the time. But also they are walking towards realism, right? Because we are almost crossing to the 20th century, right? And when you write about governesses who come from a poor family, who are women, who cannot inherit money, and they have to work in order to make ends meet, because they know that if they don't, they're going to die in poverty, right? Which was the same preoccupation that Jane Austen had, for instance, right? When she lost her father and brother. They have to write about real things, the real world, the real connections, living in a very concrete and everyday life basis, right? And this is something that we see for sure here. But I would say that overall, what links all of this is the idea of romanticism. So we can say that the sisters, they were also or maybe foremost, a romantic triumph, right? Or maybe we better change it to this, right? Which is much more appropriate with their work and what they did for us and the kind of legacy that they left behind, right? People, thank you very much. Audio, over to you.
Yeah, they are indeed difficult to, they don't fit in a box. They are, I find them fascinating because they did not write so much, we have only one novel by Emily, Wuthering Heights. That's it. And a few poems, 21 poems. So that's all. Then for Anne, we have Agnes Grey, her first novel, and then The Tenant of Windfell Hall. And that's it, just two novels. And then she died. And actually, they all died just 2 years after they published all of these books. So they published all of them in 1847. They get out of the oven, and in 1 year and a half, Emily dies. 5 months later, Anne dies, and then 4 years later, Charlotte dies. Okay, so it is very tragic. Their father, has seen his wife die and all of his 6 children die, and he lived up to 84, but he was alone. So it is interesting that they had a very brief, tragic career, and the one that wrote the most, Charlotte, wrote only 4 novels. Okay, if we compare this to Balzac, for example, in France, they were contemporaries. Okay, Balzac was alive, Balzac was writing. Dickens was alive, and Dickens was also writing. He was a bit younger than they. And Balzac wrote 94 books, 94. Okay, 94. Dickens has written dozens. I don't know how many, but certainly more than 30, for maybe 50. I don't know, but really a lot. And these three sisters, they wrote, although the books are lengthy, they did not write so much. And the things that they wrote were highly influential into many different areas of literature. They did influence Gothic fiction, as Anna was mentioning. They did influence realist fiction very much too. Dickens was starting his career. By the time they publish in 1847, he was still to write. Hard Times, David Copperfield, Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities. So many of the novels that Dickens is famous for would still be written in 20 years' time. So they were an influence for sure. Jane Eyre, for example, was very, very important for Henry James, who wrote many of the Gothic masterpieces like The Turn of the Shrew. So Virginia Woolf really respected the sisters, especially Charlotte, for their contribution to what would later become modernist literature. So there are literary critics that call Jane Eyre the birth of the modern consciousness. Maybe you have seen this in our Instagram this week. And some people consider Charlotte to be an influence over Proust, for example, one of the great writers of the 20th century in France. So it's very interesting because their legacy is very broad. It is pretty much everywhere, even in world building and fantasy, which I guess it was something new for many of you. Maybe you knew all about the other things, but probably the world building was new, right? Can you go on, Anna, please? So they are really triumphant, and in a similar vein, we'll be reading other authors from that belong to the realist school. We'll be reading Dickens, that I've mentioned quite a few times. We'll be reading Gogol, right, one of the great realists of Russia. We'll be reading other women from the 19th century, Louisa May Alcott, right, who wrote Little Women in the USA, and Edith Wharton, also considered a proto-modernist in style, very, very interesting author too. But even many others. You can see there Borges from Argentina. You can see Boccaccio from Italy, right? So great authors of whose short stories are filled with great literary quality. And so this is why we'll be reading them in translation. And finally, Lucia Berlin, that we were very glad to see her in, 2 weeks ago, the New York Times has compiled this list of masterpieces of the 21st century, right? So She's there, and we were glad that she was there because we agreed that she is pretty great. So these are the authors we'll be reading the short stories course that happens on a weekly basis, and then our students read very short stories, like up to 10 pages at home, and then they discuss in class with Anna and then their colleagues. And finally, in the novels advanced course, we'll also be reading yet another author that was influenced by the Brontë sisters, because we start with the great literary classic, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Conrad, who was Polish, right? So I find it fascinating that this guy learned English as an adult, okay? It was not that he was bilingual since he was a kid. No, as an adult, he was hunting whales in ships, and he learned with other sailors, and then he decided to engage in a literary career. Really fascinating. And this novel is a similar mix of realist, proto-modernist, and Gothic fiction. So it's really a peculiar blend that is very much indebted to Wuthering Heights, especially Wuthering Heights, also a little bit of Jane Eyre. So I find it amazing that this author that we would not associate with the sisters, in the end, it gets one of their part of their legacy. You know, the river is getting into this and this sea over here too. So we'll start with Joseph Conrad, and then we'll read other novels about conflicts, personal conflicts, and wars, and societal conflicts. We'll be reading Atonement by McEwan, a great contemporary writer. Then Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, who is one of the most celebrated writers of the USA in the 20th century. Super funny. Then we'll read a Nobel Prize winner from Sweden, Per Lagerkvist, an existential novel called The Dwarf, about Italy during the Middle Ages. It's a historical novel. And finally, Nemesis by Philip Roth, a novel that was published in 2010, and it's set during the World War II. Very touching, profoundly lyrical. So I think it's a great way, and really profoundly imbued in the realist tradition. So quite honoring the sisters, the Bronte's legacy too. Yes, Anna.
I was just going to mention that Philip Roth's Nemesis, I would say that's one of my favorite books of all time. Like it's a great book. It's touching. It's a great entrance door to Philip Roth's writing, right? He has written much during his life, and Nemesis for sure is one of the greatest, right?
Yeah.
And I would say also out of that Heart of Darkness, it has a lot of association to me to Jane Eyre, right? Because you know that Jane Eyre, many decades later, she was going to the book was going to get an adaptation in like a post-colonial way, right, by Jean Rhys, the Dominican writer who wrote White Sargasso Sea. Yes, and she tells what happens before to Jane Eyre, and it's set in Dominica, right? Dominica. And it talks a lot about something that we know for sure, that it's deeply connected with the British Empire, which is colonialism, right? So this is one of the reasons why also the Brontë, and was one of the reasons why also the Brontes, they were polemic somehow, because they were writing about things that maybe women shouldn't be messing with, politics, right? And triggering something critical, right? And they were doing it, right? And they were being brave to do it. So I think it's another gain for their writing as well.
Yeah, you're totally right. Heart of Darkness is criticizing a British colonialism, not a lot, but somewhat, and this is something that we can definitely see in Jane Eyre. So there's a connection there too.
All right. All right, everybody. So we also, because we know that reading in English might be challenging, right? It sometimes might take a lot from you. Sometimes you might feel that you're not so prepared for that. But we can give you some kind of support for that, since we offer also classes focus on English grammar, right? We have 2 levels: English Intermediate, English Advanced. Each of them, they have 2 groups, which you can alternate in between, depending on your schedule. And these are really focused in order to give you some support for you to be able to approach those challenging books, right? We know that the Brontes, for sure, they write in 19th century English. It's not easy, right? We have some advanced English there, and also some period English, periods like in Inglês histórico, right? So in this sense, you might feel that you need some help, so you can either choose between the levels, the English Intermediate, to review all the intermediate to advanced grammar, or English Advanced, in order for you to be a little bit more profuse and focus on fluency and polishing your English, for sure, right? So here are some of the prices. I don't know if you want to comment something, Audio.
No, no.
No? All right. So if you have any questions, right, you can either choose the courses by themselves, or you can make combos, English plus some of the reading courses, or 2 or more of the English course, the reading courses. And you can either pay for them monthly or for the semester that you get. Like at this time of the year, you get a lot of discount if you do so, right? So don't forget that we have all these dates available. You can either talk to us through WhatsApp or Instagram. It's up to you how you contact us. We will be there for you. Mostly, I am the person responding to you, so you're always talking to me when you contact us, because we are first and foremost teachers. We like to give this personalized contact to our students. Yes. Don't forget, classes start on the 10th of August on Saturday for the Saturday groups. We thank you very much for joining us this evening to talk about this beautiful family and their literary project. And I'm sorry, I haven't been able to read the chat while I was speaking, but I'm here and all ears for any kind of comments or questions that you would like to have, and I'll try to catch up on the on the chat while you can I don't know, write or maybe speak your questions or comments if you do have them. Thank you very much, everyone. Very nice. Thank you. Any questions? You can open your mics and speak if you want to. Hi,
Where
Lilian.
does the name Brontë come from?
Well,
Great
actually,
question.
this is something invented, right, Lilian, because the father, he was Irish, and you know how Irish history in association with the UK is, right? They tend to be demeaned, and there is a rivalry between them in more like the English putting down the Irish, right? And he was a poor man, and when he moved into the UK, into England, he had a name which had it sounds like Brontë or Prunty, like this, right? Let me just write it here, or even with a P, Brontë, but it was written with a Irish spelling, as in this, having this ending here, right? Like St. Patrick's, right? And he wanted to conceal that he was Irish. He wanted to sound less Irish and a little bit more French, right? So in order to overcome any kind of prejudice, I would say, yes.
Because it really sounds very different. It doesn't look like French, and it's different.
It doesn't. It doesn't. Yes.
And
Although
also,
we found. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
I think another thing that some literary critics comment on we know that he changed it on purpose, right? And he did use, like, the trema for us to think about about France and then maybe a French origin. And one reason behind it might have been to distance himself from his brother, because his brother was in some kind of trouble. Apparently, he was arrested, and then because he didn't pay his debts or things like that. And so apparently, because Patrick was a reverend and connected to the church, he didn't want the scandal to touch him, and so he tweaked his surname a little bit to distance himself from this more scandalous family. This is one of the theories that people also point to.
By the way, Aurel, I think I believe I read that Branwell had some behavioral problems.
Yeah, yes, very
Very
much.
much so. Yeah, very
Very
much so.
much, yes. He was struggling with addiction to opium and to alcohol, right? So he at some point, like after wearing out his health, he got TB, tuberculosis, and he passed away when he was 30. But all of the sisters, they passed away of something related to tuberculosis, right? Charlotte, she passed away while pregnant, right? Early stages of pregnancy, because something connected to tuberculosis. So he had also some problems with having relationships with married women. And
Gambling.
you're gonna see, yeah, and you're gonna see Anne talking a little bit about that fictionally in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, right? So
Yeah.
this is one of the reasons why their stories are also associated a little bit with realism, because they get some information concerning not only their personal lives, but their observance of the world and how the world works and its organization, right? So
Yeah. And not only was he, he was very, very troublesome, especially by the end of the last part of his life. There are even reports of him beating their father. So very heavy stuff, very, very heavy stuff. And he died actually because of alcoholism and opium consumption. He became a burden on the family, on the family finances, right? So this is one of the reasons that motivated the girls that cared for him and tended for him to the end. So still, Charlotte especially was very critic of him. But Emily, for example, was also critic, but very cared a lot. Some people say that she died just 3 months after he died. So and probably her grief, which was profound, Emily's grief was also an element that probably had a toll on her health. So this is one thing, and also another thing is that the relationship to Branwell might be another reason for them choosing pseudonyms. They really wanted no one to know who they were, and actually their identity was only discovered after their death. Charlotte, after the sisters were dead, she revealed the real names, but before they were very, very protective of it. And one of the reasons is likely because everybody always thought that Branwell would be the intellectual in the family, and he would be the poet, the translator, the novelist. And when the girls did it, they were kind of they wanted to spare him of the deception, maybe. And actually, there's a very high likelihood that he died without knowing that they had published the poems and the novels, actually.
Maybe not to break his heart, not to humiliate him, right?
Yeah.
But their father, they told their father, right? Because their father, he outlived the whole family, right? So he died knowing that they were successful. Yeah. So he could, their thought was he could die in peace, knowing that their children would be taken care of because they had some money, right? And I'm just seeing the mentions here, the comments, and I think that Fatima mentions that if they had to work, like there are a number of writings related to their time to write or work, otherwise they would starve. They did some governance work, so and this would also take some of their free time, right? Charlotte used to write home, very anguished that she didn't have enough time to write. Yes, this is for sure something. And at home themselves, they would do some kind of house chores, but not much because they did have somebody to work for them. They were poor, but not as much as they had to do everything themselves, right? At the time, it was customary, right? And also Vitória Magalhães is saying that Kate Bush Wuthering Heights was also covered by the Brazilian band Angra. We are huge fans, both. Well, I might not look like now, but I was a goth when I was a teenager. And Angra was my first heavy metal band to be like love, and André Matos was definitely my first crush, right? So I Oh, very nice. Oh, I didn't know that there was a character in Anne of Green Gables that quoted Jane Eyre. I don't remember that. Oh, I'm gonna check it out. My reading is old. Let me see the comments. Oh, people, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any other questions, we are for sure available, right? Hi, Leila. How are you doing? Great to see you. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. We're always available to you. Talk to us, send us messages, and we'll see each other very soon. Next week, we start our semester, right, on the 10th. And if you want to join us for this ride of the semester, you can join anytime during the semester, but also if you want to join at the beginning, you can talk to us in time to begin since the early stages of the semester. Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and see you very soon.
Thank you very much, everybody. Rest well. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.